Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is your module on the short stories of Eudora Welty. I am Shurmila Mojumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. Now, before we start actually discussing the short stories, I would like to give you a brief introduction to the form of short story, and would also like to tell you why this particular genre of short story is in a way typically American and what America has contributed to the development of this form. Now, you know, if you think the short story is a story which is short, you are not really hitting the bullseye. Short story is a literary genre which is different from the novel, the novella, and various other kinds of fiction. Now, we will begin with concentrating on the difference between a novel and a short story. Probably that will give you some idea about the ideological underpinnings of short story, about the structure, about the stylistics of the short story form. And before that, let us just have a quickly look at the biographical details of the author who is going to be discussed in this module. It's Eudora Welty. So, Eudora Welty was born on 13th April 1909 at Jackson, Mississippi. Her parents were Christian Webb Welty. He was an insurance executive, and Chestina Andrews Welty. Her mother, she was a school teacher. Eudora Welty was educated at Mississippi University for Women, Columbia Business School, University of Wisconsin-Madison. She found employment as publicity agent for Works Progress Association in Mississippi, traveled into the interiors of Mississippi, witnessing people from different walks of life. She was a skilled photographer, caught effects of Depression era on rural poor. Photographs were later published as collections, One Time, One Place in 1971 and Photographs 1989. Now, let me get back to the structure, the definition, the structure and stylistic requirements of a short story. You see, the short story, as Edgar Allan Poe has kind of defined is a piece of fiction which can be read at one single sitting, but that is rather arbitrary. What probably he meant was that short story should be short enough to engage a reader's attention at one single stretch. Now, you see, our reader's attention can last for 30 minutes and 2 hours. Without going into this, we can see that short stories are shorter than an ordinary novel. So, an ordinary short story is shorter than an ordinary novel. And what I am arguing is that because the short stories are shorter than novels, there are certain requirements which are imposed upon the short story by the sheer brevity of the form. For example, novels can have a very long period of time to cover. For example, 50 years, sometimes even 100 years, it's possible. But in short story, it's not possible because it has very little space to deal with. Secondly, the novels can have many characters, plot, and subplots and many incidents which short story cannot have for the very fact that it has to be short. Now, you see, Eudora Welty was primarily a short story writer, and we will go into the details of her short story collections and talk about how she chose to be a short story writer, and why it was so important, because she was an American, and then go into the stories as far as practicable. The first short story that was published was called Death of a Traveling Salesman. It was in 1936. The first short story collection by Eudora Welty was published in 1941, and it was called A Curtain of Green and Other Stories. Later short story collections include The Wide Net and Other Stories, 1943, The Golden Apples, 1949, and The Bride and the Innisfallen and Other Stories, 1955. Famous uncollected short stories are Where is the Voice Coming From, The Demonstrators, etc. Well, she also published longer fictions like a novella which is called The Rubber Bridegroom, 1942, also novels Delta Wedding, 1946, The Ponderheart, 1954, Losing Battles, 1970, The Optimist's Daughter, 1972. And she also published an autobiographical work, One Writer's Beginnings, 1984. She won several awards and honors. She won O. Henry Award Prize in 1941 and 1968. She won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1980, the National Book Award in 1983, the National Medal of Arts in 1983, the American Awards 2000, and Legion d'Honneur 1996. She is the first living author to have her works published in the Library of American Series. You see, in another module, I have talked about what is peculiar to America, that is called the local color movement, and I have described this as a negotiation between realist fiction in America and the preceding romantic fiction. Now, let me elaborate it slightly. The local color, as the name itself suggests, is a local color movement is a movement which encouraged and included writers who wrote about their locality, their area, the immediate surroundings, and their people, their custom, their habit, their way of life. And you have to remember that United States of America is a huge country, and so people who are living in the eastern coast and people who are living in the Midwest and people who are living in the western coast, they had very little communication between themselves in the late 19th, early 20th century, as if they were living in various different countries. And so the local colors were important in the history of American literature, because in a way they represented the entire length and breadth of the American countryside and small towns, and brought it into the prominence of American literature. So there were a huge number of short stories which were written by the local color practitioners of American short story. And secondly, one thing that I will also mention here, that many of them were women. That is also interesting, because most of the local color fiction were written by women. This is something I will recommend you to remember, because when we talk about Eudora Welty in a greater detail, we will have to remember that she came from Mississippi, and she is a woman who mostly wrote short stories and best known for her stories. She had altogether 17 short story collections. They are about characters and situations relating to Mississippi. Welty uses combination of myth and reality. The dominant style is realist. Abundance of female characters portrayed as victims of social violence, whether within or without the confines of family. So we are here talking about Eudora Welty, a woman who was born in Mississippi and died also in Mississippi at the ripe old age of 92, and she lived most of her life in Mississippi. So in a way, her fiction is also local color fiction, which talks about the people who are living in Mississippi, their typical ways of life, their customs, their food habits, their dress habits, and in that sense, her fiction is dominantly realistic. And now this very interesting question, why most of the writers of this local color movement were women. You see, when this local color movement began in the latter half of the 19th century, women were being sent to school, particularly white women. They were being sent to school, so literacy among women were growing. And another thing which contributed to the growth of short story on the American soil is the innumerable magazines that were being published from small town centers, even from villages, and there were local people who were writing in these magazines. Now, it's not very easy to publish a novel in a magazine. So, the writers were encouraged to write short story. That's one thing. Secondly, the women who were educated, who were not still not coming out into the public arena, taking up jobs in large numbers, women who were confined to their domesticity, because they were educated and there were magazines which they were reading at the privacy of their homes, they were encouraged to write about their experiences of life in and around the place where they stayed. So this local color movement had such large number of women short story writers. And as we go through the module, we will find how place plays a very important role in Eudora Welty's fiction. Her notable short stories are Why I Live at the P.O., A Piece of News, Lily Daw and the Three Ladies, A Piece of, etc. Why I Live at the P.O. is a tale of uncaring and biased behavior of family members narrated by Sister. Sister's obsession with geometrical precision and rationality carried to its limit, overtly humorous tone of narration, underlying schizophrenic tendencies, implies psychological aberrations on the part of Sister while simultaneously showing the complicity of family and social custom behind her plight. Sister becomes representative of women in the South. Now, as I was telling you, in Eudora Welty's fiction, the place is very important. And something, again, I will remind you that in the 19th century, you had writers mostly from the eastern part of the country. That is, people who lived in and around New York, Massachusetts, Boston, and in the 19th century there was this great movement towards the frontier, as a result of which the frontier was declared closed in 1890. So you see, when Eudora Welty was writing in the early 20th century, the frontier has just closed, and people from other parts of the United States, from the Midwest, from the South, they were coming up in a fairly big way to contribute to American literature. Because in a previous module, we have talked about Willa Cather, and she was from the Midwest, and in a way we talked about a novel, but though we talked about a novel, we can clearly see how the place held a very important position in the novel. The place, the Nebraska prairies, almost becomes a character with which the two major characters they interact. And Eudora Welty also comes from the American South, so far not very adequately represented in American literature apart from in the slave narratives. And here is a white woman coming from the South, coming from Mississippi, and writing about life in Mississippi. So three important things are there in her fiction. One is the centrality of the place, the other is human relationship. And you know, the human relationship that she discusses, they are sometimes controlled, changed by the place where they live in. And the other thing, important thing in her fiction is her use of classical mythology, something which is not very common among American writers. So you see, we come to this particular story, which is probably her best known, Why I Live at the Post Office. PO is post office. And the story is, there is a sister who has been divorced by her husband, and she comes back to live with her parents, and a family which is supposed to be a close-knit unit. And she is talking about a Mississippi which is not neither urbanized nor industrialized. So there is a close-knit community, at least there is supposed to be a close-knit community, but still the sister is somewhat alienated from her family and from her community. And though the overtone of the story is humorous, there is psychological underpinnings that the sister is schizophrenic, and the family members are responsible, as well as some members of the community are also responsible for this development in the sister. And that in a way, and there is a plethora of women characters in Eudora Welty's stories, and that in a way represents the condition of women in the South, though they were educated, at least some kind of basic education they had, and there was this presumption that they are free and they were living a life of their choice, but actually they were not. And that becomes clear in this story when this woman becomes schizophrenic because of her alienation from her family and her neighbors. The Wide Net and Other Stories. It was published in 1943. It's a collection of 8 stories hinged broadly on their historical Natchez trace, moves away from the realist technique of depiction towards a season of dreams. Welty uses her historical imagination in reworking the historical space of the Natchez trace, use of actual historical characters such as Aaron Burr, James Morrell, etc. Important stories in the collection are Still Moment, First Love, Livy, etc. Now you see, this is the next collection of short stories, and as I have told you, the dominant note in the first collection was realistic. So she was depicting the life around her, but in this particular collection, it is not predominantly realist. It has a dreamlike quality about it, in the sense that the stories talk about a real place, a real space, which is a marvelous example of American engineering skill, but at the same time, this is a space which is imagined, and imagined attributes are there attached to this space, though there are real life characters, but these characters do not necessarily represent the minute realist details of the place. Rather, they are instrumental in constructing the place in the imagination of the writer and the characters that she creates. A Still Moment continuation of theme of loneliness discussed in previous collection, brings together three characters from three different walks of life, each engulfed by his own obsession. Lorenzo Doe, the fanatical desire to save all souls, the devilish figure of James Murrell, the equally bigoted desire to destroy all men, and Audubon, single-mindedly bent on recording all that filled this world. The trio gaze upon the white heron in the wilderness of the trace, the perspective of each framed by his respective obsession. Audubon's sudden killing the bird fractures the momentary solidarity of the three men, resulting in each person's deep realization of being and nature. Now you see, this is a story which probably will remind many of you of another story by Sarah Orne Jewett, which is called The White Heron. It's a slightly longish story, can also be described as a novella, a very good example of local color writing in the late 19th century. Now you see, there are three men. They have three different obsessions, but they go to the same place and they watch the same bird, and the moment one kills the bird, they realize their fractured relationship, that they are all alone, that there is complete lack of communication between them, and that reminds us that we have already talked about, that Eudora Welty's short stories are about relationships, how human beings they relate to themselves, how human beings they relate to their fellow human beings, and in spite of the best efforts, how loneliness and alienation remain an integral part of human existence. Welty's third and most acclaimed short story collection consists of 7 stories. It's called The Golden Apples and was published in 1949. Linked together by their common narrative space, the fictional southern town of Morgana also features interconnected cast of characters: King MacLean, Snowdy, Ran and Eugene MacLean, Katie Rainey, Virgie Rainey, Miss Eckhart, etc. Welty's gift of integrating mythical allusions, especially elements of Celtic folklore, brought to the fore the golden apples. It's a reference to the golden apples of Atlanta in Greek mythology, the name of the town Morgana from the figure of Fata Morgana, etc. Important stories from the collection: Shower of Gold, Sad Rabbit, June Recitals, etc. It shows the plight of southern women enclosed within patriarchal confines, Snowdy, Miss Eckhart, etc., as well as their transcendence, Katie Rainey, the comparatively less vigorous male characters, Ran and Eugene MacLean, etc. So you see, Morgana will inevitably remind you of Yoknepotofa in Faulkner's fiction. This is something common to the writers who come from the South, because Faulkner is also from the South and in a way recreated the antebellum South in his fiction. So, Eudora Welty had several concerns in this collection of short stories. One is the American South. There is the consideration of women from the South, how they are confined to their domestic spaces, how they are oppressed by the social customs, and she also creates a mythical and imaginary place called Morgana. And why did she do that? Because she is trying to place her characters in a space which is not spoilt by the everyday experience of other people, other short stories. And there are plenty of such examples of imaginary places in the fiction of writers from the South. And there are mythical references as well. There are references to Greek mythology, as it is evident from the title of the short story, which is called The Golden Apples, and which is also evident from the name of the imaginary town, which is called Morgana. And there is there is one particular short story where the character of Miss, her name is Miss Eckhart. She is the chief protagonist. She is a piano teacher. She comes to Morgana. She is an independent woman who follows her passion, who lives as by earning as a piano teacher, but at the same time she has the desire to have a husband, have a family, and to integrate with life in Morgana. But that is something she never achieves, because though she follows her passion, she is an independent woman, but she is never accepted wholeheartedly within the fold of the Morgana society. And the heavily patriarchal closed society of a southern town makes it clear that women are still heavily oppressed by patriarchy and are confined to their domesticity and cannot probably follow their passion, live independently the way Miss Eckhart wanted to do. The next collection is The Bride of the Innisfallen and Other Stories. It was published in 1955. Welty is venturing out from southern concerns, so this is a decided departure. She brings in characters who are perfect outsiders to southern societies. A couple with a man from the east and the woman from the Midwest in No Place for You, My Love, and a southern girl returning to the south after being brought up elsewhere in Kin. Also featuring innovative changes in narrative technique, the subtle suggestive nature of language chillingly brought to the fore in The Burning, a story drawing on the Civil War and its effects on the defeated southern households. Circe, Welty's first explicit employment of Greek mythology, the advancements in narrative technique and handling of subject matter suggestive of the move from innocence to experience, also a feature of the development of Welty's longer fiction with time. So you see, this is a book in which she takes a definite career turn, because she comes out of her southern concerns. That's one thing. And secondly, there are characters who are not southerners. At least one comes from the east, one comes from the Midwest, and there is the story of a girl who is brought up elsewhere and comes back to south. And in the south of the United States of America, the Civil War remained an abiding topic of discussion, because the way Civil War impacted their lives in the South, it was very important. It was not so on the life of the Northerners. So the Civil War was fought, the Union Army won the fight, and the North almost forgot about it. At least it was not there in public memory for a long time. But that is exactly what happened to the South, because the life on the South prairies, on the cotton plantations, were hugely impacted by the Civil War. So there is a story in this collection which is called The Burning, which draws on the experience of the Civil War and its effect on the defeated southern households. And I will again remind you of William Faulkner, who continuously talked about the antebellum South, sometimes imaginatively reconstructed it and showed the deep scar that the Civil War left on the minds of the Southerners, their sense of loss of Eden for them. So, you see, to sum up, what I can say is that Eudora, there are a couple of things that is to be remembered about Eudora Welty, because I argued that in America, short story, the form of short story is important. Probably this is the only form that they have invented on their soil, because novel, poetry, all kinds of poetry, they were derivative forms of literature. Short story is the only form they invented, and there are certain situations in America which were particularly conducive to the writing of this short story. And I have talked about the local color movement and why there were so many women writers, and why most of these local color writings were a negotiation between realistic fiction and romantic fiction. And I have tried to show how Eudora Welty has very successfully negotiated it. You have to remember that she is a woman writer who came from the American South, and there are not too many writers from the American South apart from the writers of the slave narratives who were prominent in the 19th century. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we have several writers, and most of them are women who came from other parts of America and made big contributions to American literature. Thank you.